The third issue that the Europeans are confronting is they have an immigration problem, very different from our immigration problem in the United States, because America has a culture of assimilating its immigrants. Europe does not have a culture of assimilating its immigrants, and so it has these large sort of satellite immigrant populations who are neither of Europe, but they're not of any other place either. Mostly these are Turks or North Africans, and there are cultural differences that are very severe, and those are going to become that much more severe as there isn't an economy, a growing economy to bring them into the workforce. So Europe is going to face a real problem with its, 17, 20 million strong Muslim population. There's going to be also a problem in terms of social, what the Europeans call social solidarity. Just to give you a little statistic which came my way, 8 out of 10 Italian men under the age of 30 live with their mothers. Now that already is, cataclysmic, if you can imagine it. 50% of Spaniards, of Spanish youth, is unemployed. When you have a lot of young men without jobs hanging around, you have a recipe for social upheaval. And that is going to become that much more present, that much more evident as Europe's economic crisis continues. Let me make one final point about Europe, because I think this is important. The deepest problem that Europe has is a crisis of ideas. And you see this in the failure of the parties of the European right to understand what it is to create a growth economy. And the European left talks about social solidarity, it talks about inflating its way out of its debts, a variety of recipes which I think are all kind of disastrous. But the ideas of the European right aren't much better. And so you don't have a kind of healthy intellectual dynamic in Europe kind of leading the continent on the road to some kind of set of good policy ideas. No one in Europe talks about the need for tax cuts. Nobody in Europe talks about the need for getting rid of incredibly intrusive regulation. And just so that you understand what I mean by this regulation, there is a law in France that says that if you have under 50 employees, you don't need to pay X, Y, and Z taxes. So there's an astonishing number of companies in France that have 49 employees. Go figure, right? And then you have entrepreneurs who are the owners of 7 or 8 or 9 companies, each of them with 49 employees. Now you can imagine the kind of inefficiency and the kind of obstacle to growth a law like that creates. Instead of being able to synthesize your companies to get the advantages of scale, you have a lot of little boutique industries. In Italy, the threshold is 15 employees. That's why Italy consists of little shops. That's why the Italian economy has never grown. Well, at any rate, you have nobody in Europe, there's no American Enterprise Institute or Heritage Institution or Brookings or whatever saying, this is crazy, we got to get rid of this. So there isn't the intellectual capital within Europe to emerge from its crisis. Now let me move to, by the way, you didn't mention, George, that I'm the most depressing columnist in the United States, so that should have been added to my bio. Then let's move to Asia. Japan, until recently the world's second largest economy, is entering its 3rd decade of stagnation. India, which a lot of people said was on the point of reaching escape velocity, becoming a great economic power, is mired where India always seems to end up being mired in policy paralysis, in political weakness. The Indian economy is growing much more slowly, has inflation issues. So the Indian economy isn't sort of becoming this promised engine of economic growth. Biggest problem that you have is in China today. For the longest time, the reigning cliche was that China was going to be the next great superpower, and I'm sure some of you who are students here, if you're not, you sort of have it in the back of your mind that it might be a good idea to take Mandarin classes, because after all, we'll all have to speak Mandarin and Chinese pretty soon. It's okay, when I was in high school, everyone told us that we had to speak Japanese, and look where that turned out. So, but China today is in a kind of crisis which has become very apparent in the last few weeks. I mean, what is this business with this blind Chinese activist who made it to the American embassy? And let's leave aside the details of what the embassy did or did not do. You have a regime in China that is supposed to be so powerful and so competent and so effective, and yet it is terrified of one man, one blind Chinese lawyer who stands up for disadvantaged people in his province. This is not an illustration of just how strong the regime is, it's an illustration of how weak it is. You had what amounted to an almost coup-like situation with his character Bo Xilai, who was the mayor of a very large Chinese city, Chongqing, that has kind of rocked the Chinese political establishment, but it's rocked it because it illustrates that behind the facade of strength, you have a great deal of fragility, a great deal of vulnerability in China's political institutions. And that's also showing up in terms of China's economy. Here's a little nugget of information for about an economy that is supposed to be so strong. In the last quarter of 2011, there was $34 billion of capital flight. According to the Bank of China, 60% of all Chinese millionaires are trying to get out of the country. Now, if you're a millionaire, if you're a rich guy and China's supposed to be a great economy, then you should be investing in the country, not trying to get out of the country. So why is it that these Chinese millionaires, the people who are supposedly doing best there, are all trying to flee? Biggest problem you have right now in China is that this is an economy that has financed $2.8 trillion in stimulus spending in the year, just the last year. That's 37% of their GDP. And some of you probably in this room are aghast that the Obama administration spent, what, $800 billion in stimulus? But that's less than 10% of US GDP. So China's been spending 37% of its GDP in stimulus last year. Year before that was 42%. Now that's a lot of capital being pumped into the Chinese economy. Do you think all of this capital is being well allocated? Do you think it's all going to projects that are not going to end up as white elephants? Do you think all these roads need to be built, all these bridges, all these high-speed trains? I doubt it. What Japan did when Japan went into recession in 1989, 1990, is it went on a Keynesian spending binge. And it spent a lot of money. And what it ended up with were a lot of bridges to nowhere. You might have, people now talk about the Japanese economy as a zombie economy. A lot of companies being propped up on cheap credit and government subsidies and so on. You might have in China the makings of a zombie economy there. So this is another aspect of the global picture where you're seeing signs of fraying, of disorder, of weakness, of softness. And then finally, let me talk about my favorite area in the world, which is the Middle East. About a year ago, there was a lot of enthusiasm for what was then being described as the Arab Spring. And at the time, I was one of the few columnists, basically because, as I said, I try to be the most depressing columnist in America, who was saying, hang on, let's see where this is going. And if you ask me what my foreign policy principle is, Henry Kissinger had détente and George Kennan had containment, I would say my principle is the Larry David principle. So, curb your enthusiasm. So what we're now witnessing, as I think I expected, was that the Arab Spring, which supposedly was heralding this new period in which the old autocratic Arab order was giving way to a much more prosperous, freer, progressive, more tolerant future for the Arab world, is actually being transformed into an Islamist winner. The Islamists won big in parliamentary elections in Egypt. They swept them in Tunisia. Hezbollah effectively controls the parliament of Lebanon. Turkey has been in the hands of an Islamist government for the past 10 years. This is not freedom and progress. This is a new kind of despotism. Different from the old kind of despotism, but it's despotism. And it actually accords with the patterns of Arab history. If you sort of think back, and some of you must have seen Lawrence of Arabia, with Peter O'Toole. Well, what was Lawrence doing? He was overthrowing Ottoman despotism in the Middle East. Fine. Substitute that with British despotism in the Middle East. Well, that's then overthrown in a series of Arab revolts against the Brits in Iraq and what was then mandated Palestine in Egypt and so on. And then you get guys like Nasser, and you get the Baathists and so on. Then you have another set of revolts against some of the kings, King Faisal, King Farouk, and so on. And now you have a revolt against the autocrats. And the pattern that you find in Arab history is that when there are revolts or revolutions, typically it's a bad establishment that is overthrown and replaced by another bad establishment. So that is the picture that we are looking at in the Arab world. And the tragedy is that it may take a generation, it may take 30 years for Arabs to understand that the Islamist slogan, the Muslim Brotherhood slogan, that Islam is the solution, is wrong. But it'll be a generational process until this kind of realization dawns in the way that it's dawned to a large extent in Iran.